Who's the greatest podcaster you ever heard? You're listening to him. 1983's The Right Stuff, coming up.
On October 14th, 1947, Captain Charles Yeager shattered the sound barrier, propelled man into the future, and the search began for a new breed of men. Men who were fearless.
You've heard about our project.
Sounds dangerous.
It's very dangerous.
Count me in.
I got a rocket in my pocket.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Random Rewatch on the Movie Punditry podcast. This is 1983's The Right Stuff, directed by Phil Kaufman, and starring a whole host of people, and we're going to get into them. So I think I first saw this film in early 1984 in a theater. Kind of funny, a buddy of mine and I went on a double date, and we were in high school, and we let the girls pick the movie on Friday night, and they picked Terms of Endearment, which was a really big movie at the time, like kind of, romantic drama kind of thing. Not something that 17-year-old boys were really all that interested in. And so to make it up to us, they let us pick the movie the next day on Saturday night. And so we, of course, picked this movie, The Right Stuff, 3.5 hours of adrenaline and machismo. And needless to say, they fell asleep about 45 minutes into it, if even they lasted that long. But this was one of the greatest movie-going experiences that I have ever had. I absolutely adore this movie, and I try to watch it every few years, but it's been a while since I watched it, so I really dug getting back into it and enjoying it this time. So this movie is based on a 1979 book by Tom Wolfe called The Right Stuff. Not exactly a novel. It's more of a book that just describes the entire beginning of the space race, really, in America. And it was put out for film rights pretty quickly. Robert Chardoff and Irwin Winkler, who were the production team behind Rocky, had outbid Universal Pictures for the book. They paid $350,000, which was, in 1980, a pretty good chunk of money. They hired well-known screenwriter William Goldman to write the screenplay. Goldman's story really focused a lot on the astronauts themselves, not so much on the stuff that had led up to it. He basically cut all the Yeager stuff and the X-1 and all that stuff that happened at Edwards Air Force Base and really just kind of focused on what happened once the 7 astronauts were identified. Winkler wasn't particularly happy about that. He didn't like the fact that it ignored Yeager. Winkler and Chardoff secured financing by Universal Artists. They originally had signed up Michael Ritchie, who was known at that time for the Bad News Bears movies, would go on to direct some other stuff. That didn't really work out, so they were going to have John Avildsen, who had worked with them on the Rocky film. He directed Rocky. He would go on to direct the first 3 Karate Kids films, come back to the Rocky franchise in Rocky 5, and he did Lean on Me. So he was set up to be the original director of the film. And then they also got Bill Conti involved to do the score. Bill Conti had scored the Rocky movie. So this was kind of the Rocky team getting together to put this film together. But the deal with Avildsen fell through, and they wound up getting Phil Kaufman, who had just finished The Wanderers. And he was well known for doing the 1978 remake of Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which is a great film. Kaufman did not like Goldman's script for the same reasons that Winkler did, and he didn't like the fact that Yeager had been taken out of it. He thought it was also kind of overly patriotic, which, given the final film, I can't even imagine what Goldman's script had looked like. So Goldman quits the project. This causes United Artists to back out, so they're out. Kaufman is trying to rewrite the film. He tries to get Tom Wolfe, who had written the book, to get involved with it, but Wolf had no interest in doing it, so Kaufman winds up rewriting it. And he leans kind of more heavily into the whole Yeager thing because in his viewpoint, if you're going to tell the story of the space race, you have to start with the test pilots. And if you're going to do that, you have to start with Chuck Yeager. The project goes into turnaround, which is when producers kind of shop a project around to get some additional financing or some additional help to get it done. And he winds up, Winkler and Chartoff wind up making a deal with the Ladd Company, which had been founded by Alan Ladd Jr., who was the producer who kind of famously greenlit Star Wars when he was working for Fox. He started, along with a couple other people, Jake Cantner, Gareth Wigan, they started their own film production company in 1979. And the Ladd Company had done some really great films. They were responsible for Chariots of Fire in 1981, Outland in 1981, another really underrated, underknown film. Body Heat, Looker, Blade Runner, Night Shift, which gave us Michael Keaton. 1983, they were working on, or they had released in 1983, Twice Upon a Time, which is an animated film, and The Right Stuff. The Ladd Company had, at this time, they had a production deal with Warner Brothers. And the way that works is that these production companies, they make the movies. They got kind of a built-in deal with distributors like Warner Brothers. So they make movies kind of under the Warner Brothers banner. Kind of like Spielberg did with Universal for a long time. Like Tom Cruise did with Paramount, that type of thing. So they've got a director, they've got a script, they've got financing, they've got distribution, and they're ready to start working on this film. They bring Yeager in, the actual General Chuck Yeager, in as a technical consultant. So a lot of the film is very accurate in terms of the things that happen, like the technology and the way the pilots are when they're flying the spacecraft or they're flying aircraft. A lot of the technical stuff is really, really good. The historical stuff is not entirely accurate, which is pretty common for these historical dramas. You got to remember that Phil Kaufman's job in this, the whole producers, their job in this is to make an entertaining film. And so they will often accentuate, elaborate, emphasize things that, you know, maybe are stretching the truth a little bit, or they make some changes for dramatic purposes to make things more entertaining. Their job is to entertain people. This isn't a documentary. So there are some fairly significant historical differences. For instance, you know, Yeager's flights in the X-1 and the XF-104 were kind of staged in the film as like, oh, let's just decide to do this on a whim. And he goes out and does these things, when in actuality, he had flown both of those flights before, both of those planes before the events that were depicted in the film. Those flights were well planned and well staged out. Jack Ridley, who is Chuck Yeager's friend and companion, played by Lee Von Helm in this film, is shown being there in the 1960s when Yeager goes and flies the XF-104. Jack Ridley died in 1957. He wasn't part of that. They're showing Grissom and Cooper at Edwards Air Force Base in 1953. They weren't there at that point. They didn't get there until much later. And then the whole thing with Grissom and the capsule malfunction. We'll talk about that when we get to that point in the film. That was a pretty big distortion of what had happened there. And so a lot of the astronauts who are in this film, the Mercury 7, they're not particularly fond of this film because it doesn't really depict their lives the way they were. Some of the stuff with the wives also is like kind of just embellished for dramatic purposes. But in terms of the history of it, in terms of like the technicality and stuff of it, that stuff is all pretty dead on. And a lot of these people said that Yeager was a very big presence during the production of this film. One, because of his legacy, and what he had accomplished, and also as a force of his personality. And he is also, we'll get to it, he's also in the film. And we'll talk about that when we see him. He has a small part in the film. So this film is largely shot in and around San Francisco. They used the abandoned Hamilton Air Force Base at the time. The base was in a kind of a standby status, which meant that the Department of Defense owned it. It was still technically an Air Force base, but there was nobody there. It wasn't actively being used. They did do quite a bit of filming out in the Mojave Desert for the Edwards Air Force Base stuff. You can't make San Francisco look like the Mojave Desert, so they actually had to go out to the Mojave Desert. The actors were given a lot of film to study of their historical counterparts. Yeager would take them up, he would take them flying and explain to them the nuances of, their jobs and what the jobs of the astronauts would have been at that time. There was a lot of special effects in this film, and by special effects, I mean models and mock-ups, and those, obviously they didn't have CGI in those days, so they would build full-scale aircraft, full-scale spaceships. They would build scale models of very accurate scale models of these aircraft and film them, running on wires. At one point, I think either the X-1 or the F-104, they would literally shoot it off a catapult to film it flying through the air. Kaufman sent his editing team to NASA with a list of shots and documentary footage that he wanted, and they would comb through thousands of hours of footage to find exactly the right footage that is intercut into this. It's either intercut into this film, or they would recreate it with the actual actors, almost word for word, almost motion for motion in a lot of cases. They went out and found some footage of the Russian space program that nobody had seen since like the 1950s, and they were able to get a hold of some of that. And so they were able to use some of that to thicken up the film a little bit. They had brought in Jordan Belson, who is an abstract filmmaker. He makes like very surreal kind of filming, and he was tasked to do some of the imaging of like Earth from space, or what it felt like to go through the speed limit, all those kind of surreal images that you see in some of the flights was that stuff. And Belson wouldn't even tell the other filmmakers or the producers how he accomplished some of the stuff that he accomplished. The Air Force was a big help in this. They had an Air Force officer, a Colonel Duncan Wilmore, who was a technical consultant as part of his job with the Air Force. He had actually gotten some of the aircraft for the film, including the B-29 they dropped the X-1 from. They had plane clubs, these guys who build and restore like World War II and Korean War aircraft. They had, at the time it was called the Confederate Air Force. Now it's called the Commemorative Air Force, but they keep like B-29s and all these other ships. And so they were involved in the filming. There's a bunch of there was like over 80 planes, individual planes that were part of this film. Some of them were mock-ups. A lot of them were actually real aircraft, including some of the helicopters and some of the fighter planes. The X-1 was all mock-ups. The XF-104, there was a model built of it, but there was also, they used a real F-104 that had been modified to look like the NF-104. It's an NF-104, not an XF-104. So they went to a lot of trouble to really try to make that part of the film as realistic as possible. And I think it pays off. It really kind of shows in the film. They bring in Caleb Deschanel to be the cinematographer. He's the one who shot the film. He is, if you recognize the name, he is the father of Emily and Zoe Deschanel, the actresses. Emily, of course, known for the TV series Bones. Zoe, known for New Girl, Elf, Failure to Launch, Hitchhiker's Guide. And their mother is also in the film. Mary Jo Deschanel, she plays Annie Glenn. We'll talk a little bit more about her when we get to that. Caleb Deschanel, though, is one of the great American cinematographers. You kind of talk about him and Roger Deakins almost in the same breath. He did, before this, he had done Being There. He had done The Black Stallion. After this, he would go on to do dozens of films, including, The Patriot, National Treasure, Passion of the Christ, Spiderwick Chronicles, still working Jack Reacher, the new Lion King movie, Jon Favreau's Lion King movie. Just a really well-accomplished guy, and a lot of the reason why this film looks the way that it looks. So let's get into it. So we start with this tremendous opening narration by Levon Helm. Levon Helm, of course, well known as the drummer and sometimes lead singer of The Band, as well as an actor in several movies, including more recently Shooter, the Mark Wahlberg movie. Helm's got just such this unique voice that you're kind of instantly hooked into it.
There was a demon that lived in the air. They said whoever challenged him would die. Their controls would freeze up. Their planes would buffet wildly, and they would disintegrate. The demon lived at Mach 1 on the meter, 750 miles an hour, where the air could no longer move out.
So this movie's got, kind of this combination of, like, this is the history of it, and also this kind of ethereal, there's a greater piece to it. So he starts with this, notion about there being a beast that lives out in the air, but then he wants you to understand what you're talking about. So he kind of gives you the quick breakdown about test pilots.
Then they built a small plane, the X-1, to try and break the sound barrier. And men came to the high desert of California to ride it. They were called test pilots. And no one knew their names.
And now we are out at Edwards Air Force Base. So this is 1947. It's actually not Edwards Air Force Base at this point. It's Muroc Army Airfield. It would become Edwards Air Force Base in 1950. But we are we're talking about the flight of the X-1, which is the first plane to break through the sound barrier. We meet a bunch of people, including Slick Goodland, who is a test pilot who wants to get paid to try to break the sound barrier. And then we meet Captain Chuck Yeager, played by the great Sam Shepard. Shepard is kind of an interesting choice to play this guy. I mean, yeah, he's an actor, but he's probably more well-known throughout his career as a playwright. 58 plays, I think he wrote. He won a bunch of Obie Awards. He won a Pulitzer Prize for a play called Buried Child. People have called him one of the greatest American playwrights, but he's also an actor and would get an Oscar nomination for this one. We'll talk about that at the end. The thing about Shepard is he's got kind of this quietness to him, which supposedly really kind of echoes what Chuck Yeager's personality at this point was really like. He had kind of this quiet authority to him, and Sam Shepard seems to really kind of pull that off. There's also this other bit about, we see kind of a crash, and we see this this house out in the desert, and a car pulls up, and this tall, lanky guy in a black suit gets out. This is Royal Dano, who is a well-known Western actor, Gunsmoke, and dozens of movies. This scene is kind of echoed later in Saving Private Ryan. I think Spielberg kind of apes this, but this is clearly, he's here to tell this woman that her husband has died in the crash that we had witnessed. So we get this idea right away that this is all very dangerous. But Yeager agrees to make the attempt to break the sound barrier, doesn't want any additional payment because in his mind, hey, the Air Force is already paying him. We meet his wife. We don't initially know that it's his wife, but it is his wife, played by Barbara Hershey. There's an accident. He breaks his arm. They have to come up with this jerry-rig of the hatch. We get this little dialogue between him and Ridley, which would come back later.
Ready to go.
Hey, Ridley, you got any Beemans?
Yeah, I think I got a stick.
Loan me some, will you? I'll pay you back later.
Fair enough.
And then we have this exciting sequence where Yeager actually breaks the sound barrier. We find out that nobody can know about it, and we start to get led into this little piece of, the space race, Cold War issues that are going on. This film is really kind of divided into, I think, like maybe 3 sections, right? You've got the stuff that happens out at Edwards Air Force Base in the beginning of the film. You've got the section where they're doing like the astronaut selections, training, putting everything together. And then you have the third section of the film, which starts with, the first launch and then what happens to the astronauts while they're actually astronauts. We see that they're out at this place out in the desert, this bar called Pancho's Happy Bottom Riding Club. That is a real name. Pancho Barnes, who is played in this film by Kim Stanley. She is the owner of it. She is a well-known pilot, one of the real pioneers of aviation. She was one of the founders of the first union for stunt pilots for movies. She broke Amelia Earhart's airspeed record. She was a plane racer. She was a member of the 99s, which was an organization back in like the 1920s and 30s, which provided networking and training and stuff for women who wanted to become pilots. So when we see her in here talking about pilots and giving crap to Cooper and Grissom,
I tell you, we got 2 categories of pilots around here. We got your prime pilots that get all the hot planes, and we got your pud knockers who dream about getting the hot planes. Now, what are you 2 pud knockers gonna have, huh?
This is not just some random bar owner. This is a woman who she knows what she's talking about, and she's done all the things that these guys have done. The bartender here at Pancho's is, in fact, General Chuck Yeager, the guy who asks Harry Shearer and Jeff Goldblum if they want anything to drink, and Harry Shearer says he wants a Coke with ice. That's Chuck Yeager. So we meet Gordo Cooper, we meet Gus Grissom, we meet some of the guys who are like trying to get pilots to join the space program or to do other things. There's, so you have like guys like Yeager and Scott Crossfield who are, these test pilots out there at Edwards, and they don't want any part of the space race because they are thinking that these guys are not going to be pilots. They're just going to be somebody that they strap into the capsule and launch, and they're not really going to be able to act as pilots.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite get what you said.
What I said was lab rabbits.
What's that supposed to mean?
Well, that just means that you boys don't need no honest-to-God pilots. What you ought to get is a little old lab rabbit to curl up inside your damn capsule. With his heart going pitter-patter, wire up the kazoo.
At one point, Yeager calling him pilot's going to be spam in a can. But you have guys like Cooper and Grissom who are looking for the next thing. They recognize that these guys, like Yeager, Crossfield, like these guys have made their mark on history. They're looking for whatever they can do to make their mark on history. And so they're really interested in whatever's coming up. We hear about more about the space race, that it's called Sputnik. We meet our recruiters. As I mentioned, Harry Shearer, Jeff Goldblum in a very early role. I think Goldblum's great in this. And not that Harry Shearer's not, but I think Goldblum really, he's got a kind of almost a seriousness to him. I mean, yes, they're also brought in for comic relief. These guys they can be funny, but Goldblum's also got kind of this earnestness to this. You know, like when they're in a hotel room watching the Bill Dana, the Ed Sullivan Show thing. You know, he's kind of got the seriousness about him that I find pretty interesting. You know, obviously they have the scene in the White House with LBJ and Eisenhower where, you know, they're coming up with like really stupid ideas about who could be an astronaut. And Eisenhower's like, no, I want test pilots. And, you know, the German who is supposed to be Werner von Braun, they never name him that, but that's who he's supposed to be. It's like, oh, Mr. President, somebody else, anybody else. You can't handle test pilots. But I think these two guys bring an important part to the film. We start to meet the wives. The really interesting part about this film is that the wives really are characters in it, and they really have a part in it. We meet, you know, Pamela Reed, who is Gordo Cooper's wife, Trudy. It's obviously they don't have the perfect marriage made in heaven, but we hear Gordo give kind of his, you know, signature phrase.
Come on, Trudy. Who's the best pilot you ever saw? Huh? Who's the best pilot you ever saw? You're looking at it, baby.
But they get out to Edwards, and living conditions are not the greatest. It's clear that she's not really particularly happy about being there. We meet Veronica Cartwright, who's Betty Grissom. We meet Mickey Crocker, who's playing Marge Slayton. And we start to get an idea of these wives as part of the larger story. In part of the scene that I mentioned before, where they're watching, where Harry Shearer and Jeff Goldblum watching TV, we also get to meet John Glenn via an appearance on a TV show played by Ed Harris. It's hard to imagine, but at this point, nobody knew who Ed Harris was. You know, he had a couple of really small roles in, you know, films like Coma and Borderline and Creepshow, but he was not the legend that he would go to be. You know, we're so used to him playing like these kind of really hard-edged characters like Frank Hummel in The Rock, or Gene Kranz in Apollo 13, or Admiral Kane in Maverick, or, you know, Wilford in what's that train movie? Snowpiercer, right? Or the Man in Black in Westworld. So to see him playing like this goody two-shoes guy in this film is really kind of, you know, in retrospect, is really kind of off-putting a little bit, but he plays it so fantastically.
All the other guys liked her too, and she didn't pay any attention. But I kept after her, Eddie.
Did you finally get her to notice you?
Yes, I did. In fact, I finally got her to marry me.
We meet Alan Shepard, Navy pilot, who is kind of the opposite of John Glenn. He's just kind of wisecracking, sarcastic comedian type almost.
It's a hazardous undertaking. In fact, it's extremely hazardous, if you get my meaning.
It's so hazardous that if you decide not to volunteer, it will not be held against you in any way.
Sounds dangerous.
It is. Very dangerous.
Count me in.
But he's all in for it. And now we have this whole new section where we are at, I guess, kind of the medical screening. We meet Scott Carpenter. We meet Wally Schirra, played by Lance Hendrickson, again, an unknown at this point, who I think has like one line in the film, if he even has that, which is kind of hard to imagine. I have a feeling a lot of his stuff maybe got cut out. So this medical, a couple of things about this kind of medical testing. One, this was actually a lot of the kind of testing that they did do. So there is Gonzalez, who is a orderly, who is played by Anthony Munoz, who is a professional football player. They wound up having him just lip sync his dialogue, and then they had somebody come in and ADR it afterwards. We talked about what that is last time. It's where somebody goes into a sound booth and records the dialogue. It's very apparent in this. you could really tell that that is actually not him speaking. We also have Nurse Murch, who is played by Jane Dornacher. Interesting person, Jane Dornacher. She was a musician. She was she led a band called Layla and the Snakes. She was also like a professional songwriter who worked with the Tubes. She did stand-up comedy, I think. She did acting, obviously. And she was also a radio personality. And she actually became well-known as a traffic reporter. She started at a radio station in San Francisco and then eventually moved to New York. She was well-known for being able to talk really quickly and clearly. And I remember her on traffic stations in New York. She worked for WNBC, which would eventually become WFAN. Tragic, interesting thing about her, she was in a helicopter crash. She was a helicopter traffic reporter over New York. She was in a helicopter crash in April of 1986, which she survived, went back to work, and in October of 1986, she was in a second helicopter crash. The helicopter that she was in fell into the Hudson River, and she was heard on air saying, hit the water, and the helicopter fell into the water. The pilot survived, but she unfortunately was killed at that point. And there was apparently a memorial concert for her in San Francisco where like the Tubes, the Grateful Dead, and a bunch of other bands played. So it's an interesting little piece of trivia. So then you have the press conference where we finally get our 7, and John Glenn gives this little speech.
I was brought up believing that you were placed on Earth here more or less with sort of a 50-50 proposition. And this is what I still believe. We're placed here with certain talents and capabilities, and it's up to each one of us to use those talents and capabilities as best you can.
Not to be outdone, Gordo Cooper gives his own little bit.
And I think that we are all very, very fortunate that we have been, should we say, blessed with the talents that have been picked for something like this. And I think that we would be most remiss in our duty indeed if we did not volunteer for something that is as important as this is to our country and to the world in general right now.
And then there's this question about, do you go to church? And Alan Shepard pipes up and says,
You go to church regularly. Come on.
Yes, as far as church goes, I attend regularly.
You could take it or leave it whether or not you believe him at that point. There's also the question about whether or not the first American in space is going to be a chimpanzee or is going to be an astronaut. The scientists would prefer for it to be the chimpanzee, which of course it wound up being. So there's the unveiling of the capsule, and there's this argument between the scientists, the engineers, and the astronauts as to the amount of control that the astronauts are going to have, because they are, after all, pilots. So there's this conversation about, is there going to be a hatch with explosive bolts that they can open? Are there going to be controls? And the astronauts learn to leverage their fame and leverage the fact that it's about money. Everything's about money. The money's going to come from there being astronauts in the capsule, not necessarily just a monkey or a dummy.
Boys know what makes this bird go up. Funding makes this bird go up.
That's right. No bucks. No Buck Rogers.
And so they, threaten to call in the press, and so the engineers have to concede to them. It's actually a great little sequence, and we see the astronauts really starting to come together as a cohesive team, as a cohesive unit. But we do see that the chimp is launched. We do see that Yuri Gagarin, the Russian, goes into space. And then we have the launch of the first American going into space. And they hold off until the last minute to tell us who it's going to be. Now, if you have any interest in this history, you already know that it's Alan Shepard. But they still, the way they make it, they hold off on the drama. You see him kind of out of focus a little bit. You don't see his face. They never tell you, and you don't find out until he's already seated in the capsule, and this is the last interaction with him and John Glenn. and you find out that it's Alan Shepard. And then they go through this really funny sequence where there's a hold. Well, first they do what's become known as the Shepherd's Prayer.
Dear Lord, please don't let me f*** up.
I didn't quite copy that. Say again, please.
I said everything's A-okay.
Yeah, well,
Which was
that's
something
what I
that
thought
Alan
you
Shepard did say over an open mic. It wasn't necessarily exactly that, but it was definitely the same sentiment with the same kind of salty language to it. I think he said, really, okay, Shepard, don't F this up. But it basically became known as the Shepherd's Prayer. And then there's this hold, which actually did happen. Actually, the launch was delayed a whole day. They had him in the capsule. They had to get him out of the capsule because of weather. They got him back in the capsule the next day. It was still kind of cloudy. They were still waiting. There was like 2.5 hours of delay. They had a problem with one of the oxygen tanks. And, so Shepard's bolted into this thing, and he really did need to go to relieve himself. And he did wind up relieving himself in his suit. All of that is 100% true. And fortunately, the suit is air conditioned, so they had to wait for the suit to dry out. So the suit dried out pretty quickly. And he did give the iconic line over the radio to let's get things moving.
It's questionable whether we can proceed.
All right, I'm cooler than you are. Why don't you fix your little problems and light this candle?
He's right. Let's light this candle. He surely is. Light the candle.
Yes. Resume the countdown.
And so they did, obviously, in fact, light the candle, and Alan Shepard, first American in space. They do this, thing where he comes down and he goes and he meets Kennedy, and they do this intercut way before Forrest Gump, guys. They did the intercut with our actor Scott Glenn and real footage of John Kennedy giving Alan Shepard the medal. We didn't talk about Scott Glenn. Another guy who has had a great career. He'd been around a little bit longer than some of the other guys who were in this film. A lot of small roles. Was in Apocalypse Now, was in More American Graffiti, was kind of well known as kind of the bad guy in Urban Cowboy, which was kind of a big movie in 1980. But he had been working pretty steadily for 10, 12 years and came into this, and this just did nothing but kind of expand his career a little bit. And he'd go on to do, obviously, Hunt for Red October, Silence of the Lambs, Backdraft, bunch of stuff. Still working today. I mean, obviously, he's got a recurring role in Bad Monkey. He's got a film coming out, like a horror film coming out. So, very long career for Scott Glenn. It's kind of confusing. You have Scott Glenn playing Alan Shepard. You have Sam Shepard playing Chuck Yeager. You have John Glenn played by Harris. I mean, a lot of the same names floating around between the actors and the characters. The whole point of Shepard's flight, there's this thing where you see him counting and then kept saying that he was okay.
8. That's 9. Okay.
That was kind of the whole point of the flight. It was a suborbital flight. He didn't go into orbit. He just went into space. But they wanted to subject him to as many G's as they could. And the target was 9 G's. And he had to show that an astronaut could survive 9 G's and stay in control, which Alan Shepard did. And we go on with the second launch, Gus Grissom's launch, and the famous incident where on Splashdown, the hatch blew. So the film has it portrayed pretty much very ambiguously. You can kind of leave it up to you, but I think the way the film is kind of leading is like Grissom screwed up, or at least everybody around him thinks he screwed up. There's no parade, there's no trip to the White House, and everybody kind of looks at him funny. But in reality, they've pretty much proven that there's no way that Gus Grissom could have released that hatch. He would have had to have unstrapped himself from the seat and move into a very awkward position. there's no way that he could have done that unintentionally. And if you listen to the recordings, he was not in a panic. He was very calm. He was very much in control. Pretty much nobody at NASA ever thought that he was responsible for that. And it's been pretty much the accepted version of events that there was a technical malfunction and the hatch blew once the spacecraft hit the water. He was never scheduled to go to the White House, and he did get a call from President Kennedy. So they really did Gus Grissom dirty in this movie. As great as Fred Ward is, and Fred Ward is absolutely fantastic in this. Another guy who's just had a really, really great career, passed away a couple of years ago. He had 3 films come out this year, 1983. He had Silkwood, Uncommon Valor, and The Right Stuff, all of which great movies. The next year, he would do Remo Williams, which is kind of really, if you didn't know him from Silkwood or The Right Stuff, then you definitely came to know him from Remo Williams. And he would just go on to have a really, really great career with lots and lots and lots of work. You have the scene where they're back at Poncho's and they're talking about this, and it's Yeager who comes to Grissom's defense.
You think a monkey knows he's sitting on top of a rocket that might explode? These astronaut boys, they know that, see? I'll tell you something. It takes a special kind of man to volunteer for a suicide mission, especially when it's on TV. Oh, Gussie did all right.
And now we move on to John Glenn's launch, and it's scrubbed, and there's this, situation with him and his wife, where they get his wife on the phone. So Annie Glenn did have a stuttering issue. Not that her stuttering issue ever slowed her down. She was a force of nature for her entire life, advocating tirelessly for children's education, especially children with speech difficulties. She wrote a book called The Astronaut's Wives Club, which was later adapted into a television series where she gives the wives' side of the story in terms of what it was like to be a wife of a Mercury 7 astronaut. She was a professor of speech pathology, received multiple awards and honors. This woman was just absolutely a powerhouse. Played here, as we spoke, by Mary Jo Deschanel, the wife of Caleb Deschanel, mother of Emily and Zoe, and a actress in her own right who has done some really great work. Well known, of course, for the TV series Twin Peaks. LBJ here, played by Donald Moffat. If there was ever an actor who was meant to play a role, it may be Donald Moffat playing LBJ. He's really great. Just the right amount of comedy and actual genuineness. But this is another instance where the astronauts kind of band together. John Glenn tells Annie, if you don't want him in the house, he doesn't come in the house. The head of the astronaut office is there, and he's like, you can't do that. I'm going to switch up the assignments, and, the astronauts are not having any of it.
It's the vice president, the head of the program. You're going to think of the broader interests of this program.
You are way out of line here.
I'm out of line?
Yes, sir.
I'm running this show here.
We'll see about that.
Yeah? And I'm thinking of changing the order of flight assignments.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
Who you gonna get?
Who am I going to get?
You heard what he said.
That's right.
Just take it easy, fellas. Huh? Step aside, pal.
And so they finally really start to assert their power. We have a cutaway to Poncho's, a fire at Poncho's, which actually happened. The place did actually burn down. Then we have this weird kind of sequence at the end with John Glenn's flight, a lot of which did happen. There was a time where there was a problem with the heat shield. Glenn did actually see lights outside the capsule, which he did describe as fireflies.
I see something strange out here. Oh, my goodness gracious, what the heck is that?
Sparks, needles of some kind all over the sky. This is Friendship 7, so let me tell you what I'm in up here. I'm in a
mass of some very small particles that are brilliantly lit up, like they're luminescent. I never saw anything like it. The whole shower of them coming by me now, they're bright, bright yellow. They're all lit up. They swirl around the capsule and they go in front of the window and they're brilliantly lighted. You don't think these things could be alive, do you?
Gordo Cooper was in Australia, but they do this weird kind of thing with the Aborigine shaman and the fire and the music, and they just kind of go off on this little tangent, which this movie does do once in a while. John Glenn's flight was not cut short. It was always supposed to be 3 orbits, but it was, obviously another very successful milestone. There was a ticker tape parade. They did show that. Notice Grissom's there. And we move on to really kind of the end of the film, which is this kind of cross-cutting between Yeager taking up the NF-104 for an altitude record and this barbecue in Texas that LBJ is hosting. We, see this interaction between Yeager and Ridley, which echoes what we saw during the X-1 flight.
Hey, Ridley.
Yeah,
You got any Beemans?
I might have, Miss Dick.
Well, loan me some, would you? I'll pay you back later.
Fair enough.
Think I see a plane over here with my name on it.
Now you're talking.
We have this, strange fan dance thing. And Yeager does, break the altitude record. He does, and this actually happened. He did lose the aircraft to a spin, and he did crash. He was really significantly burned on the side of his face, which you could see a little bit of here. They don't really show it. They don't call attention to it. It's in the makeup, but they don't really point it out all that much. And then you have, Jack Ridley going out across the desert. It's intercut with the press talking to Gordo Cooper. So let's talk about this for a minute. One, Dennis Quaid, who was not very well known at the time. This was kind of his coming out year. He had done Jaws 3D, had been released this year during the summer. Absolutely terrible movie. I cannot suggest that you watch it. But he was the lead in it. He had done a bunch of other stuff, a lot of smaller parts. I don't know that I have ever seen an actor as charismatic as Dennis Quaid is playing Gordo Cooper in this film. I mean, he's got a smile that is just too big for his face. He is so charming. He is so you want to hang out with this guy all the time. I don't know what Gordo Cooper is like in real life, but if he's half as charismatic as Dennis Quaid is playing him, that must be something really to behold. The press corps in this film, you'll notice, is all a bunch of the same guys. And they are played by a San Francisco comedy troupe called Fratelli Bologna, or the Bologna Brothers. These guys do they do events, they do corporate things, they do trade shows, they were known for doing all kinds of sketch comedy and all kinds of stuff. So Kaufman brought these guys in to be the press corps, and you'll notice whenever you hear them in the background is this chattering noise, which comes from the motorized cameras that they would just play behind them. But these guys are all, it's a comedy troupe, and if you know that and you watch this, you can almost kind of see the signs of it, especially kind of the lead guy. He does seem a little bit goofy, but they're talking to him and they're asking him, they ask him the question that he asks everybody. It's who's the greatest pilot you've ever seen? He seems to kind of get sidelined a little bit.
Right here in this room.
Gus has got to be a great pilot.
And some of them are still out there somewhere, doing what they always do, going up each day in a hurtling piece of machinery, putting their hides out on the line, hanging it out over the edge,
pushing back the outside of that envelope and hauling it back in. But there was one pilot I once saw who I think truly did have the right.
How close did you ever...
The pictures on the wall obviously referring to the pictures in ponchos of the pilots who have all died in flight accidents. And he seems like he's about to say Yeager when he kind of comes back to himself.
Who was the best pilot I ever saw?
Yeah!
Well, you're looking at him.
But you have Yeager, the crash and the ambulance going across the desert. There's this great line when they finally see him walking away from the crash.
Over there. Is that a man? Yeah, you're damn right it is.
And of course, the Bill Conti music is swelling and, it's this big triumphal moment. And then we have a hard cut back to Gordo Cooper sleeping in his capsule. And then he launches and the music's coming and everybody's cheering. Look, I'm getting emotional. Everybody's cheering and, you have Grissom, go hot dog, go. And then you have this great voiceover, again from Lee Von Helm, at the end of the film.
But on that glorious day in May 1963, Gordo Cooper went higher, farther, and faster than any other American. 22 complete orbits around the world. He was the last American ever to go into space alone. And for a brief moment, Gordo Cooper became the greatest pilot anyone had ever seen.
And Bill Conti's music comes back in, and, that's the end of the film. And this is, for me, this is honestly, this is one of the most emotional moments in film that I can really remember being young and impressionable. But even today, this is man, and I don't mean men, I mean mankind, at the top of its game, coming together. This is not about American exceptionalism. This is not about jingoism. This is not about, patriotism. This is just about people coming together to be the best that they can be and achieve amazing things. And we need a little bit more of that, I think. But anyway, so that's the movie. That's The Right Stuff. This movie was put out into limited release in October of 1983. It earned $1.6 million on its opening weekend. It was like in 200 theaters. It was put into wide release in February of 1984. Earned another $1.6 million. This movie was a disaster. It was a box office flop. It earned a total of $21 million on a budget of $27 million. This and the disastrous results of Twice Upon a Time went a long way towards the eventual demise of the Ladd Company. I mean, they would go on, continue to do movies, but their next two films, Star 80, Mike's Murder, were both pretty awful and did not do well. And by the time 1984 came around and Police Academy hit, which was a success, the writing was kind of on the wall. The Ladd Company's been in and out, been reformed, rebranded a couple of times, but this movie was kind of a nail in its coffin. It's got a 92 on Rotten Tomatoes. It's got a 91 on Metacritic. Roger Ebert named it one of the best films of 1983. He put it on his list of films of the 80s. He put it at number 2. Gene Siskel put it at number 3. This film received widely critical acclaim, but, it's almost a 3.5 hour long movie about some very technical things, and it's tough for this film. It became a kind of home movie staple, but in terms of its original box office, it was not great. What didn't help the fact is that these astronauts did not like it. They thought it was very well done, but they thought it kind of distorted the truth in a lot of places, and so None of them did any interview. The actual astronauts did not do any interviews around it. And that was a big kind of marketing loss there, because if you could get, John Glenn or Gordon Cooper or Alan Shepard to talk about your movie, then that would be kind of a big deal. Chuck Yeager liked it, and he did kind of talk about it. Chuck Yeager, by the way, outlived all of the Mercury 7 astronauts. I think John Glenn was the last one to pass away in 2016. Yeager died in 2020. Yeah, 2020. Film got nominated for Best Picture, Best Cinematography, Best Art Direction, also Best Supporting Actor for Sam Shepard. It won Academy Awards for editing, original score, sound, and sound effects editing. Won a bunch of Critics Circle Awards. They released it on DVD in 2003 with a bunch of extras, including 3 documentaries. And then in 2013, they did a 30th anniversary Blu-ray set with a 40-page book that included all the special features from the 2003 version of it. And then in 2020, Disney Plus released a TV series based on the book and the film adaptation, which is actually pretty good. So that's it. That's The Right Stuff. I cannot recommend this film enough. Go out and watch it. And when you're done doing that, tell your friends about it, have them go watch it, and then tell your friends about us and our podcast. We've got some interesting stuff coming up, and I look forward to talking to you again. Thanks for listening.